let me just first give a brief rundown of what I'm going to talk about in this presentation. First, I'm going to give a little bit of background about threats to the Amazon from deforestation. I'm going to introduce the Upper Xingu region in the southern Amazon. I'll talk a little bit about history and archaeology and the built or domesticated landscapes that ancient cultures developed. Then I'll go into Amazonian dark earth and how those soils store carbon. Then I'll get to the focus on the Upper Xingu, explain who are the Xinguanus and the Kwikuru, how they live, and how they modify the soil to create dark earth. Then I'll talk a little bit about how archaeology of the region demonstrates that there were many more people living there in the past. And then finally, I'll talk about recent threats and what the Kwikuru are doing to combat them. So this is an image of the Kwikuru village. And there's always a circular plaza. And if you can see my cursor here, in the center is a men's house and a cemetery area. And it's also the area where they do their rituals and ceremonies. And then there's the plaza surrounded by a ring of houses with backyards and refuse disposal areas that we're going to talk about. So first of all, this map shows deforestation in the Amazon until the yellow shows deforestation up to 2019, and the red shows forest fires in August of 2019. And so you can see there's this, especially around the edges of the Amazon, the whole southern and eastern edge of the Amazon, much of it has been already deforested. And then you have deforestation on these, like the Trans-Amazon highways. And it's also concentrated along some of the major rivers. So we could say that the whole entire Amazon basin is in danger of being close to reaching a tipping point, because we know, for example, that the forest in the middle of the Amazon receives about half its rainfall from the forest, from transpiration from the forest to the east. And the forest all the way over in the western part of the Amazon receives about 80% of its rainfall from transpiration. So once you start cutting down all this forest, it's going to reduce the rainfall all the way across the basin. So add that together with climate change and the droughts brought on by climate change and deforestation, and you have a recipe for disaster. So a tipping point is when you reach small changes add up to some big change, a big important change. And we can see that from this map, since 2001, the Amazon has lost 65.8 million acres of primary forest, equivalent to the size of the UK or the state of Colorado. And since 2019, the forest fires and deforestation have greatly increased since the new administration of Bolsonaro entered in Brasilia. They've basically incentivized opening up protected areas for ranching, for logging, for mining, for petroleum. So there's been a lot of invasions of indigenous land and national forests since Bolsonaro took office. So this is the Xingu Basin, the Xingu watershed outlined by the yellow line. And in the south is near the headwaters is the Xingu Indigenous territory. And that was actually the first indigenous area that was created in Brazil in the 1960s. It's about 2 million hectares in size, about 4 million acres in size. And the Upper Xingu, you can see here, is like a peninsula of green sticking down into all of this area has been deforested. And we call this the arc of deforestation along the eastern and southern edge of the Amazon basin. So you can see that the only real significant forest left in this region is in indigenous areas. So indigenous areas are very important for protecting the ecosystem in the forest. This shows the Xingu Indigenous Territory, and this on the left is from 1992, and you can see the deforestation reaching starting to get close to the border of the park. And then on the right, from 2019, you can see that the deforestation has pretty much reached the edge of the territory and completely surrounds it. They do have problems with people invading, cutting down forest, trying to do illegal logging on their territory. And this is what it looks like in the landscape outside of the indigenous territory, where it started off mainly as cattle ranches, but now a lot of it has been converted into industrial agriculture, principally soybeans and also a lot of corn. So I'll just go back in time a little bit to a little bit of history. So in 1541 and 1542, Francisco de Orellana descended the Amazon. He was the first European to descend the Amazon. And he wrote, Padre that was with on the journey wrote an account. And he basically told of very dense populations, very powerful chiefs, complex societies, the best porcelain in the world, superabundance of food. But one of the main points was that it was this whole along the river was completely occupied with villages and towns, densely situated on the landscape. By the time European explorers in the 19th century went to the Amazon, they described a very different reality. They talked about abandoned villages, abandoned fields, and scattered indigenous populations. So something had changed very drastically during that time. And that was a result mainly of epidemic diseases that swept through, probably from the time of Orellana, and also from war, conflict, and slave raiding, principally by the Portuguese, who would go up and capture slaves and bring them downriver. By the time there was a very prominent archaeologist named Betty Meggers was working in the Amazon, beginning in about the 1950s. She developed a theory based on what she saw at her time, and she didn't see the large, dense populations of indigenous people. And she hypothesized that the Amazon was a very hostile environment. And there was an older idea, even before that, the Amazon was uninhabitable before the development of agriculture. Now we know that's not true. So she believed that there were serious environmental limitations imposed on people, so that they were the rainforest environment was unable to sustain dense populations and complex societies. There could only be small, egalitarian, autonomous villages. The villages moved frequently. They lived off of small-scale horticulture, and also the areas of dark earth that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. She believed that they were a result of repeated use of villages repeatedly going back to the same place, rather than large permanent settlements. So since Betty Meggers was carrying out her field work, there's been a lot of archaeological field work that has been done. And this is a map, the most complete map we have of database we have of archaeological sites in the Amazon. The yellow shows sites that were registered as having dark earth on the site. Certainly there's many sites that are not included in this database. So there are many more sites than this. And then I show the upper Xingu down where the blue circle is. So here's an archaeological site in the middle of the Amazon. It's called Caverna da Pedra Pintada, because there's rock art paintings there on the walls. And it was excavated by Anna Roosevelt and dated to about 13,000 years ago. So we know there were people in the Amazon 13,000 years ago, probably earlier than that. Since then, there's been a lot of work done especially in different caves around the Amazon, and many dates from about between 11 and 12,000 years ago. So we know there were quite a few people in the Amazon by 11,000 years ago. This is one example of an archaeological culture in Marajo Island at the mouth of the Amazon. And they were prominent there for about 1,000 years, from about 300 AD to about 1400 or 1300 AD. And these are some of their ceramics. Those large urns are burial urns that they would bury their dead inside an urn. And they also did dramatic modifications to the landscape. So they created large mounds in this area of Marajo Island is a seasonally flooded savanna. So they created these large mounds to live on, and some of them are up to like more than 10 meters high above the normal ground level. They were built up over time from deposits of construction and just normal living deposits. Like even there's some layers of dark earth. We find house floors, hearths within this mound. So you can see the stratigraphy there. There's many other kinds of built landscapes or domesticated landscapes throughout the Amazon in South America. One is like shown here, the geoglyphs in Acre, mostly in Acre and Bolivia in the southwestern Amazon. We also have raised fields and domesticated landscapes in Bolivia in the Llanos de Mojos. And there's the Llanos of Venezuela, which are, what they have in common is that they're seasonally flooded savanna areas. And then also on the coast of the Guianas and the upper Xingu that I'm going to talk about, Marajo Island and the central Amazon. So we see these kinds of landscape modifications all over the Amazon. And these are the geoglyph sites have these ditches in geometric shapes, and then the sites have roads that connect one to another. And there's been hundreds of these sites found in the Western Amazon. Here's another example of raised fields in Bolivia that cover very large areas. And also they have these forest islands that are artificial. They were constructed, and they're connected with one another by these raised causeways. And they had canals also going next to the raised causeways, connecting up these forest islands on the landscape. And these were also occupation sites where people lived to get up above the flood. Here's another example of raised fields in French Guiana. So all along the coast of the Guianas, we find these areas of raised fields. There's the Amazon dark earths. I like to call them just dark earths. Here's an example in the central Amazon at the Hatahara site. And you see this deep dark earth over 1 meter deep and it's full of ceramic fragments as well as lithics and other artifacts. Lithics are stone artifacts, as well as remains of flora and fauna that we find in microbotanical remains and remains of animals like deer or turtles or fish. Many of the sites also, we find burials within them, and it's rare to find a burial outside of a urn because usually they're destroyed by the acid soil in the Amazon, but the dark earth and the mounds protect these burials. Here's another example of a whole bunch of urns that are buried in this mound of dark earth. So Terra Preta, it's called Terra Preta in Brazil, which means black earth. And it's also called Amazonian dark earth in the literature, but I prefer just to use the term dark earth. It's an anthropic soil, which means that it was created or formed from human activities. And it's also an archaeological remain that's full of artifacts and ecofacts or botanical remains and animal and fish remains. It's also usually a settlement site where there was a village or a town in the past. And it's characterized by dark color, abundant charcoal, many artifacts. It can cover extensive areas up to like 80 or 100 hectares in size. And it can be up to over 2 meters deep in some places. The properties of the soil, it has elevated organic carbon, a high pH that makes it more fertile, less acid. And it also has many nutrients that are important for plants and crop cultivation, like calcium, magnesium, potassium, manganese, phosphorus, and zinc. It also has a reduced aluminum and iron that can also help with soil fertility. It helps make it one of the most fertile soils in the world. Dark earth is full of carbon, organic carbon, and also charcoal. So charcoal is a form of organic carbon, and it's one of the most carbon-rich soils on Earth. It also contains about as much carbon in the top 1 meter of soil as all of the above ground biomass. So you've got the carbon in the biomass of the forest is about more or less equal to the carbon in the dark earth of archaeological sites. Back to the Upper Xingu and the Kwikuru village. I just want to point out that our project, all of our research is in a partnership with the Kwikuru community. And they have an association called the Kwikuru Indigenous Association of the Upper Xingu, ICAX. And all of the data and maps and images and everything belongs to the Kwikuru. So actually, even if we want to publish any of this, we actually have to get permission from them first before we can publish it, even if it's data that we created. So here's a picture of 3 great chiefs from the Xingu. On the left is Aritana. He was one of the most important chiefs of the Upper Xingu, the Xinguano culture. And sadly, he passed away just recently from COVID. And then in the middle is, you probably heard of Hauni Kayapo. He's from lower downstream in the Xingu River, but he's been active in fighting to protect the Amazon. And then on the right is a Fukaka. He's the main chief of the Kwikuru. He is also a close friend, and he's the one who's instrumental in supporting the research in the Kwikuru community. So I just want to point out too that, this COVID has been pretty bad for Indigenous people because the older generation is the most susceptible, and they are also the ones who hold the most cultural knowledge, knowledge of the language. So when the older folks pass away, a lot of that knowledge can be lost. The Xinguanos are the Upper Xingu Society, and it's a group of about 8 different ethnic groups. They speak different languages, but the other elements of their culture are basically the same. So they dress the same, they have the same houses, the same rituals, the same type of agriculture and fishing and technology. So it's sort of like, you can think of it sort of like Europe, where basically everybody uses the same technology, but they still speak different languages. And it's also very common to interact and even intermarry. So they've been able to keep their traditions and their culture more or less intact because they were one of the first Indigenous reservations, and also because they were in an isolated area. And another factor is that they decided right away at the beginning that they were not going to allow missionaries to come in. So they weren't missionized, and that helped them hang on to their culture. So just some photos to show. This is the center of the plaza, and there's the chief distributing food. They also have a traditional wrestling tournaments that they do. They get together with groups from other villages and have wrestling tournaments. They play soccer almost every day. They're really into soccer. The women are prominent in the Xinguano society. So here they also have wrestling tournaments as well. And women can also be important chiefs. Their staple are based on fishing and manioc agriculture. So they don't eat very much, they don't eat any large game. They don't eat very much game at all. They eat almost exclusively fish, and they have a taboo against blood and large game meat. They focus on fishing, and there's a lot of different places to fish. They have technologies to get fish in just about any body of water that they can find. Here's an example of large fish weirs that they create. This is a community fish weir that goes all the way across the river. And then they put these large fish traps in. When the water's high, they can just go out and collect the fish from the fish traps every day. Manioc agriculture. Manioc is their staple crop. And here's a picture of a manioc field. And then they have a very intensive processing to get the toxic acid out of the manioc before they consume it. So here's a woman grating manioc and peeling manioc. Here's on the left is a picture of a whole family working in the field next to the village. harvesting and replanting manioc. And on the right is someone harvesting manioc, pulling these large roots out of the ground. So some of the activities that we did in our field work was mapping. We used a lot of GPS for mapping and sample collection of soil samples from archaeological excavations. And we did a laboratory analysis on ceramics as well as soils. And we're also studying botanical remains, phytoliths, and starch grains. And then some of the recent research I've done is ethnographic research, where we carried out interviews focusing on their beliefs and practices for managing the soil and dark earth and creating dark earth. So for example, here, different activity areas within the village have different impacts on modifying the soil. So you've got like fire hearths, you've got manioc processing in the house, in the backyard, manioc storage here, sleeping areas here with fire hearths between the hammocks. So all of these have different impacts on the soil, and they can have their own soil signatures if we look at their soil properties and chemistry. Here are some examples of house construction. They cover their houses with a type of grass called sapé, which grows in their abandoned fields, in their fallow fields. Also, they make a lot of handicrafts, like here is a wooden bench being made. And here's another, they have fire hearths inside their houses in the center of the house. And they're also storing corn, hanging it up to dry. Here's what on the left is a typical chief's house. That's what it looks like. So you can actually just look at the house and you know it's a chief's house. In the backyard, you have all kinds of activities going on. Here's a manioc drying rack where they put the manioc pulp after they process it to dry. And sometimes they have occasionally house fires that could burn a house, and then it ends up like this, and they have to clean all of that up and then throw it out into their refuse disposal area, and then they'll build a new house in the same spot. So all of these have different impacts on the soil and end up forming this dark earth and making the soil more fertile. Here's an example of some of the things they make. So there's a very large wooden bench. There's a wooden hoe or shovel. There's basketry, masks. And the point here is that most of their material culture is organic, which means that it's not going to show up in the archaeological record. It's going to decompose and become part of the dark earth. What they do is they'll clean up their organic trash from the backyard, carry it down the trail and dump it on the edge, or dump it in a trash midden area where it ends up piling it up and forming mounds, similar to, you could think of like a compost mound. Up in the upper left, there's a woman, she's cleaning the fire hearth inside the house, and she takes the ash and charcoal and she dumps it out in the trash midden area, or she might take it and spread it out in a wider area on the soil surface to improve the soil for planting. So here is what one of these active trash middens looks like. And here we're actually taking samples inside this trash midden. But these are the main ingredients that go into a trash midden: ash and charcoal, manioc waste, fish waste, fruit waste, leaves and grass, wood chips, and then some durable things like ceramics also go in there. So that's what mainly ends up forming the dark earth. So these refuse middens form patterns of mounds. Here you have a map of the village with the houses, and then the black are the trash middens. And then on the left in the photo, you can see they get mounded up to about 50 or 60 centimeters high. And this forms a pattern around the site. As soon as these trash mounds start to form, they start to use them for cultivation as well. Here is a field in an archaeological site that has dark earth, about 10 kilometers away from the village. And so they seek out this dark earth at archaeological sites for planting all their other crops besides manioc. So they also plant manioc in the dark earth as well. But all these other crops like bananas, papaya, sweet potatoes, they typically don't do well in the normal soils. So they're grown in dark earth, in either in archaeological sites or in their own backyards in the dark earth that they're creating in their own village. So here's some examples of activities on the edge of the village or on the periphery or just outside the village that create this dark earth and fertile soil for planting. So one of the things that they do is they'll burn weeds and debris. They'll also do in-field burning. Another practice is to spread ash and charcoal around the base of plants and trees that they plant. Here, they've spread manioc waste over the ground surface in an area. They plan to go back and later plant that area with crops. So here's that photo we saw before of them planting crops in an area similar to this, right on the edge of the village that has received a lot of organic waste as soil amendments. And then they gather up, in their fields, they gather up the unburnt wood and crop residue and waste and burn it in the field. So that also adds ash and charcoal to the soil, improving the fertility. And they do some processing of crops in the field as well. So all of that can add to the fertility of the soil. We did some interviews and we transcribed the interviews and translated them into Portuguese, and then I translated them into English. But here is an example from an interview with one Kwikuru woman, and this is what she says about dark earth. Their word for dark earth is egepe, so they have their own word for it. So she says, after we sweep, we throw it outside to become egepe. For us to plant, principally ash. Ash is what works. Charcoal and ash we sweep, gather it up, and then throw it where we will plant to turn into beautiful egepe. There we can plant sweet potatoes. When you plant where there is no egepe, it is weak. The soil is weak. That is why we throw the ash, manioc peelings, and manioc pulp, and then it turns into beautiful egepe. So they speak with pride about these activities and the fact that they create this dark earth. They're very proud when they talk about this. Now I'm just gonna talk a little bit briefly about the archaeology of the Upper Xingu and how it shows that there were many more people in the past. So here you see the Kwikuru village that we were looking at. This is their formal village entrance, which also doubles as a airport runway. And then this patch of altered forest that you see here is a large archaeological site. This is what it looks like when we mapped it. So you got about 1 kilometer between the current village and the edge of the site. This site is called Nokugu, and it's located on the uplands or terra firma along this river right here. So the green lines are ditches. The red lines are linear mounds, and these linear mounds surround the plazas and they border roads. And then there's roads that go out of the ancient settlement and connected to other settlements on the landscape. Here's a zooming in on it, and you can see actually this site, we have dates that going back about 2,000 years, but the main occupation of the site was over about 1,000-year period from about 750 to about 1700 AD. Of course, it's still occupied today. People don't live there right now, but there have been villages on and near this site in the last couple of centuries. So they've been using this site intensively for cultivation, for hunting, for fishing. That's why it's partially deforested. So also this site grew over time. So it started out smaller and then got bigger. They built a new plaza, built a new ditch, built another ditch. So at one time, we believe there may have been 2,000 or 3,000 people living here. This shows what we did, how we mapped these sites using GPS, following these features along in the forest and taking points. And then we did archaeological excavations at the site. And within all those excavations, we collected soil samples, as well as outside of the excavations, we collected additional soil samples. And this shows what these mounds and ditches look like in the field. So at the top, we have an archaeological trench bisecting a plaza mound up here at two different sites. So you got a plaza mound that's about 1 meter high. And then at the bottom are these ditches. This is what it looks like in the forest. And then we have also a trench that we excavated bisecting the ditch to try to figure out how old it was and how it was built. Here's another archaeological site. The blue is the line are ditches. The yellow lines are the mounds, and here's a plaza. We have a transect of soil samples and test pits going across the site here. And I'm just going to point out these two arrows here. I'm going to show you two test pits, one from a central area of the site, a residential area, and one from a periphery of the site near the ditch. And you can see the difference here. So the top is from the central area where you have dark earth. And the bottom of the site is still a modified soil. It's a brown soil, but it's much less modified than the central area. And these on the left are results from the transect. So you have at the top is organic carbon. In the middle is pH, soil pH. And the bottom is a whole group of different variables that are increased by human activities, such as phosphorus, calcium, magnetic susceptibility, and a whole range of different elements like barium, strontium. So the transect begins at the edge of the floodplain, goes across the residential area. And here you see there's less modification in the area of the plaza. And then there's again more modification on the other side of the plaza. And then it decreases as you reach the periphery of the village. Here's an artist's rendition of what one of these sites may have looked like in the past. And I think it's pretty close. So you have the central circular plaza, the roads going out, the houses. One thing that it doesn't show are the trash middens, which basically what we've seen from archaeological research is that the trash middens go in ring-shaped or arcs around the houses. So you have basically all the area in between houses was filled with trash middens. And then you also get concentrations along the edges of the roads and the plaza. Outside the site, you have fields and peaky orchards, fruit orchards. And you could have had also some cultivation going on within the ditches of the settlement. Up here at the top is the village, the Kwikuru village, and then that site, Nokugu. And then you have the roads connecting one to another. So you got about 5 kilometers in between sites, 4 or 5 kilometers between each of these major sites connected by roads. And then across the rivers, you have other sites on both sides of the river. Here's the Kuluwini River that becomes the Xingu. This whole area is the floodplain. And then this narrow part is the uplands where the settlements are located. So at some time in the past, they probably farmed much of this area of uplands was fields at some time in the past. And it did seem like it affects the susceptibility to forest fires today. So some of the areas that may have been farmed in the past could be more susceptible to forest fires. And on the other hand, some of the archaeological sites with dark earth seem like they can be more resilient to forest fires. With our research, one of the things we started doing a few years ago is creating an online geoportal with using Esri software, and then field collectors like Survey 123 and Collector, where we can collect data in the field, upload it, and it resides. All the data resides in the cloud. Anybody who we give access to can have access to this data at whatever level you choose. And this is good because it gives the Kwikuru access to all of this data if they want. And we've also trained a team of research assistants who are now well trained to do soil sampling, excavations, collect data with GPS. They can go out on their own, collect GPS data or use a tablet to collect all kinds of data in the field. Once COVID hit, we took our online GIS and adapted it to monitor patients and created a dashboard so we could monitor cases of COVID. And we also helped them, we did crowdfunding and helped them set up ICU unit so they can have an isolation unit. We helped them with the crowdfunding, buy equipment and oxygen, and also to hire a doctor and a nurse to stay in the village and care for any patients. We were, I would say, very successful because we managed to get up until today, not a single death from COVID in the villages that we work with, in the Kwikudu villages that we work with. And this has been in the news a lot as well in Brazil. There's been a whole bunch of news stories on this. Besides COVID, the Upper Xingu faces a lot of threats from especially recent droughts in the last 20 years, forest fires that have swept all the way across the Upper Xingu and knocked down large areas of forest. So I've seen these immense areas of forest where almost all the trees are knocked down. There's only a few trees standing left. It makes it very hard to move around in the landscape to do field work or for them to move around and hunt and fish. So we've got problems with forest fires. In the last few years, they've set up teams of firefighters that go around and do prescribed burning to try to control these forest fires. But the new government has also cut funding for that. They have the threat from industrial agriculture surrounding the territory. So they've been pressured a lot to open up their land for soybean cultivation, to lease their land out to farmers for soybean cultivation. They're always going to face pressure from mining interests, petroleum interests. There was a Canadian firm a few years ago that I guess they were doing survey for natural gas. So there's a threat of even fracking in this region. They've already noticed a decline in fish and a decline in wildlife, and a loss of forest. So with their loss of forest, they could face declines in wildlife. With water pollution, also sedimentation of the rivers can affect the fish populations, which they depend on. I just also wanted to share that we formed a group of researchers who work in the Xingu, not only in the Upper Xingu, but in the whole Xingu as well. We call it the Amazon Hopes Collective. And we've been working with the Pennywise Foundation in Vermont to do our crowdfunding. And if anybody is interested in learning more about the Kwikudu and the Upper Xingu, they can go to this site. And if you want to support the project or support the Kwikudu, you can donate at this site. And you can also click on this story map here. And there's a beautiful story map with a lot of photos and information about the Upper Xingu and the Kwikudu. I want to thank the Kwikudu community, especially, who are partners in the research, and also Michael Heckenberger, who began archaeological research in 1993. Carlos Fausto is an ethnographer who's been working since the late 1990s with the Kwikudu, and Bruno Franchetto is a linguist. They're both from the National Museum in Rio, and Bruna has been working with the Kwikudu since about the 1970s, and she just completed a Kwikudu dictionary. That was her life's work. So I've been working with them on all of this research. I would like to, I guess at this point, open it up for questions.